They never fought each other in a declared war. No American infantryman ever squared off against a Soviet soldier on a battlefield where both sides wore their own flags and fired under their own orders. And yet, from the closing days of World War II through the long frozen tension of the Cold War, Soviet soldiers knew exactly who American troops were, what American weapons could do, and what it meant when American forces were on the other side of a line. The fear was real. It was documented. It showed up in interrogation reports, in captured diaries, in the private letters of Soviet officers who never intended their words to be read by anyone outside their own families. It showed up in the way Soviet military doctrine was written and rewritten, again and again, in direct response to capabilities that American forces demonstrated in conflicts the Soviets watched with intense and anxious attention. Understanding why requires going back to the moment when the two armies first stood in close proximity to each other and took each other's measure. That moment came in April of 1945, on the banks of the Elbe River in Germany, when advancing American forces moving from the west and Soviet forces moving from the east linked up and shook hands in the ruins of a collapsing Reich. The meeting was celebrated publicly as a triumph of Allied cooperation. In private, both sides were studying each other with the calculating eyes of men who understood that the current alliance was temporary and the rivalry that would follow was not. But the thing that struck Soviet observers most deeply was not any single weapon or piece of equipment. It was the overall picture of American logistics, the sheer volume of material that the United States had produced and moved across an ocean and sustained across a continent of active warfare. The Soviet war effort had been heroic in ways that genuinely inspired awe, built on sacrifice and endurance, and a willingness to absorb losses that would have broken almost any other nation. The American war effort had been built on something different, the capacity to manufacture and supply on a scale that simply had no precedent in military history. Soviet generals who understood logistics, and the best of them understood it very well, recognized that fighting a nation capable of that kind of industrial output was a fundamentally different problem from fighting Germany. The Cold War that followed turned this mutual assessment into a permanent condition. Soviet military planners spent decades trying to understand what American forces could actually do in a major conflict, and the picture that emerged from their analysis was not a comfortable one. The Korean War, which began in 1950, and brought American forces into combat against Soviet-equipped and Soviet-advised North Korean and later Chinese forces, provided the first detailed look at American military performance in the post-war era. What Soviet analysts took away from Korea was mixed, but ultimately alarming. American ground forces in the early days of the war had performed poorly, thrown into combat unprepared after years of post-war drawdown. Initially pushed back badly by a North Korean army that knew its terrain and had been preparing for exactly this kind of fight. Soviet reports from that period noted American weaknesses with some satisfaction. But as the war continued and American forces regrouped, reinforced, and began fighting at full capacity, the picture changed significantly. American firepower, in particular the ability to call in close air support, naval gunfire, and massed artillery on demand, and with precision, made American defensive positions extraordinarily difficult to overrun. Chinese and North Korean units that had learned to manage the Soviet way of war found themselves facing something different when they pushed against American lines. The volume of firepower that American commanders could concentrate on a specific point in a short period of time exceeded what Soviet doctrine had prepared them to expect. Units that broke through an initial defensive line and pressed their advantage found that American forces could rapidly shift fire, fall back to prepared secondary positions, and then call in air and artillery that made the ground those attacking units now stood on untenable. The tactical flexibility that American junior officers demonstrated, improvising under pressure and calling for support with a speed and accuracy that Soviet-trained officers were not accustomed to, was noted in detail in the reports that made their way back through Soviet intelligence channels. Vietnam, paradoxically, both reassured and alarmed Soviet military planners at the same time. The inability of American forces to achieve a decisive strategic outcome against a determined guerrilla opponent suggested limitations in American military power that Soviet doctrine had postulated but not confirmed. For a decade and a half, North Vietnamese forces equipped largely with Soviet weapons held off and eventually outlasted the most powerful military in the world. That outcome was carefully studied in Moscow and used to support arguments within the Soviet military about the limits of American resolve and the vulnerability of American public opinion to sustained casualties over time. But the tactical performance of American units in Vietnam told a different story at the unit level. American soldiers in individual engagements consistently demonstrated firepower, air support coordination, and medical evacuation capabilities that were simply beyond anything Soviet-equipped opponents could match. The helicopter changed the battlefield in ways that Soviet planners found particularly concerning. American forces could appear almost anywhere with speed that ground-based Soviet forces couldn't replicate, extract their wounded with an efficiency that kept casualty rates survivable, and concentrate combat power at points of their choosing rather than being forced to fight on the enemy's terms. The performance of American equipment in the conflicts of the 1960s and 1970s, observed and analyzed through proxy forces and captured hardware, gave Soviet engineers specific problems to solve. The M16 rifle, initially troubled by reliability issues in Vietnam that Soviet intelligence tracked with close interest, evolved into a weapon that Soviet small arms designers studied with genuine respect. American night vision technology, advancing through generations of development that Soviet industry struggled to match, gave American forces in low-light conditions capabilities that Soviet doctrine had no good answer to. The ability of American forward air controllers to bring precise strikes onto targets with short notice was something Soviet ground commanders genuinely feared, because they had watched what it did to forces on the receiving end. The 1973 Arab-Israeli War provided perhaps the most detailed single intelligence windfall of the Cold War era regarding American military equipment. Israeli forces, equipped primarily with American weapons and trained extensively by American advisors, faced Arab armies equipped with Soviet weapons and organized along Soviet doctrinal lines. The results were analyzed exhaustively in Moscow, and what emerged from that analysis was genuinely alarming. American anti-tank missiles performed far beyond what Soviet estimates had predicted. American-designed tanks and aircraft proved substantially more capable than their Soviet equivalents across most performance metrics. The tactical edge that American training and equipment gave Israeli forces in combined arms operations suggested that a direct NATO confrontation with Warsaw Pact forces in Central Europe might not go the way Soviet planners had hoped. Those internal assessments, portions of which became known to Western analysts through defectors and intelligence operations, painted a picture of genuine anxiety. Soviet officers who were honest with themselves and with their superiors recognized that American forces had qualitative advantages in several areas that were very difficult to offset with the quantitative advantages that Soviet force structure emphasized. Numbers matter enormously in warfare, and the Soviet military had a lot of numbers. But numbers operate within a context, and the context that American firepower and technology created was one in which mass alone was not a sufficient answer. The training gap was perhaps the most consistently noted concern. American military training, expensive and time-consuming in ways that Soviet conscript-based force structure made difficult to replicate, produced soldiers who could operate their equipment under stress, make independent decisions when communication failed, and adapt to unexpected situations with a flexibility that Soviet small unit leaders were not trained to match. Soviet doctrine was built around centralized control, detailed planning, and the assumption that every unit would execute its assigned role within a framework set by higher headquarters. American doctrine assumed that lower-ranking soldiers and officers would make good decisions independently when circumstances required it. In the fog and friction of actual combat, the American approach had advantages that Soviet planners recognized and could not easily counter. Individual American soldiers were trained with a thoroughness that Soviet military observers noted repeatedly. An American infantryman arriving at his unit from advanced training had a foundation of weapons proficiency, land navigation, first aid, and small unit tactics that represented a significant investment of time and resources. Soviet conscripts arrived at their units with less individual training and were expected to develop competence primarily through collective unit training, which worked well when units were stable and experienced, but broke down badly when casualties forced rapid replacement of experienced soldiers with untrained ones. American force structure was designed to sustain individual quality, even under attrition. Soviet force structure was designed to sustain mass. Both approaches had logic behind them, but Soviet officers who studied American training records with access to honest intelligence data knew which approach produced a more dangerous individual opponent. The American NCO Corps was a specific subject of study and, frankly, envy within Soviet military analysis. Non-commissioned officers in the American system, sergeants at every level, held a degree of authority and professional responsibility that had no real equivalent in Soviet practice. American sergeants were expected to train their soldiers, enforce standards, make tactical decisions, and sustain unit cohesion even when officers were unavailable. They were, in the truest sense, the backbone of the force, and experienced Soviet officers who understood this recognized that it gave American small units a resilience that Soviet equivalents lacked. A Soviet unit that lost its officers in the first minutes of combat might struggle badly. An American unit in the same situation had sergeants who were trained to take charge and keep fighting. Technology, particularly in the air, was a source of persistent anxiety in Soviet military planning throughout the Cold War. American air power after Korea had developed in directions that made Soviet air defense planners genuinely nervous. The ability of American tactical aircraft to fly at low altitude and high speed, find targets with electronic systems that Soviet forces could not reliably jam, and deliver weapons with precision that earlier generations of aircraft couldn't achieve, posed a threat to Soviet ground forces that had no clean solution. Soviet air defense was extensive and layered and had genuine capability, but American aircraft designers and electronic warfare specialists spent decades specifically studying Soviet air defense and developing tools to defeat it. The back and forth between American aircraft and Soviet surface-to-air missiles was one of the defining technological competitions of the Cold War, and Soviet planners were never quite comfortable that they were winning it. The nuclear dimension hung over all of this analysis in ways that are difficult to separate from conventional military assessments. Soviet military doctrine assumed that a major conflict in Europe would involve nuclear weapons relatively early, and American tactical nuclear capabilities were extensive and well integrated into NATO planning. The prospect of fighting American forces who might use nuclear artillery, nuclear-tipped missiles, or tactical nuclear strikes at the moment Soviet armor achieved a breakthrough was something Soviet planners had to account for, and accounting for it was genuinely difficult. Nuclear weapons changed the calculus of mass in ways that favored the side with better precision over the side with more numbers, and that was consistently the American side. What made all of this so consequential was that Soviet soldiers were not ignorant of these assessments. Armies talk. Intelligence moves through informal channels as well as official ones. Soviet officers who had spent time studying American capabilities at staff colleges and in intelligence assignments came back to their units with a clearer picture than their subordinates had. And some of what they knew filtered down through the ranks in the way that knowledge always does in a military organization. The soldiers and junior officers who would actually have to fight American forces knew, in the way that fighting men develop an instinct for these things, that American troops were not an opponent to take lightly. The diaries of Soviet soldiers who served as advisors in conflicts where they observed American firepower firsthand contain passages that are remarkably candid about this. Men who watched American airstrikes, who examined the wreckage left by American artillery, or who debriefed survivors of engagements with American-equipped forces came away with impressions that shaped their professional judgment for the rest of their careers. They weren't afraid in the way that the word is sometimes used dismissively. They were afraid in the way that intelligent, experienced military professionals become afraid when they have an honest picture of what they're up against. That honesty was, in the end, one of the things that kept the Cold War cold. Soviet military planning was realistic enough, at its core, to recognize that a direct conventional conflict with American forces carried risks that made the outcome genuinely uncertain. And that genuine uncertainty, in a nuclear-armed world, was sufficient reason to look very hard for alternatives to direct confrontation. The fear wasn't paralyzing. Soviet forces remained capable, determined, and genuinely dangerous. But the respect that American military capability commanded within the Soviet system was real, documented, and consequential. It shaped decisions made in Moscow for 40 years, and it remains one of the more important and least discussed elements of how the Cold War actually worked. Two armies that never fought each other directly, and the fear of what that fight would look like, may have been the single most important stabilizing force of the 20th century.